Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. Maritime security remains a critical concern in an interconnected world, where piracy, geopolitical rivalries, threats to vital choke points and undersea infrastructure undermine global stability. To explore these challenges, I invited Professor Tim Edmunds. Welcome.
Nice to see you, Martin.
Tim is a professor of international security and the head of the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol in England. He also serves as a co-director of the Safe Seas Network on maritime security. His research focuses on security policy, capacity building, and security sector reform within the maritime security domain. Professor Edmunds has written over 100 publications, and I include all important links in the YouTube description. Today we have 4 topics. We will speak about piracy, we will speak about geopolitical assertiveness, critical maritime choke points, and also about the undersea infrastructure, especially cables and internet. So let's start with the first question, and let's start with the piracy. We know piracy from movies, from stories, and as children we were watching, like how pirates are hidden somewhere in the sea and then they attack a sea. But today it's 2025. We have all the satellites, sensors, drones, all the technology, and still we are reading and we are researching piracy. So Tim, how the maritime piracy evolved and how it has basically go from the stories to real critical global issue? What's about geography, tactics, and organization today?
So, piracy is a contemporary phenomena that we see in the ocean space today. We see various piracy hotspots still around the world in the Gulf of Guinea and Southeast Asia, in recent times off the coast of Somalia, but also in less well-known areas in the Caribbean, off the coast of Latin America, Bay of Bengal, and so on. So piracy is a highly diverse and widespread activity. It is in part a response to, at least contemporary piracy, is in part a response to a wider industrialization or acceleration of the way in which we as human societies have come to use the oceans, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years. So this is a phenomena that is called by Swedish researchers the blue acceleration. And if we look in almost every area of maritime activity, whether that is trade flows through container ships, whether it's in terms of critical infrastructures at sea, whether it's in terms of cruise tourism, in almost all these fishing, for example, we see a really very, very stark increase in human activity over the last 30 or 40 years. That increases our dependencies on the oceans, the dependencies of our societies and our economies on the oceans, but it also creates vulnerabilities for us, and it creates opportunities for those like pirates who want to predate on those trade flows, particularly. However, it's actually quite difficult when we look at contemporary piracy to talk about piracy as a single phenomenon. Piracy is extremely diverse worldwide, and along a number of different axes. So the first is that the first basic question of how we even define piracy is something that is contested or open to interpretation. So the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea actually has a very specific definition of piracy. It says these are attacks on ships between two vessels that take place on the high seas. So not in the territorial waters of states, but on the high seas. And then there are special provisions within UNCLOS to deal with that sort of piracy. Now, if we look in most parts of the world, most piracies actually take place in territorial waters, and so are more properly sometimes called armed robbery at sea, sea robbery, and so on. So we have a kind of legal contention around, or legal differences around what piracy is and the legal instruments that gives to states to deal with those pirates. We also might see an axis between sophisticated and low-level or petty piracy. So some piracy is thieving from ships, from ship crew belongings and so on. But the kind of piracy we tend to be interested in, or more interested in maritime security, is sophisticated piracy, which is carried out by highly organized criminal networks, often with very sophisticated criminal finance and money laundering mechanisms underpinning their activities, and able to adapt to different kinds of pressures and opportunities. Then within that, we see different sorts of pressures and opportunities in different parts of the world. So piracy looks very different, for example, in the Gulf of Guinea than it does in Southeast Asia, than it did in Somalia. Somali piracy was primarily focused around a highly lucrative kidnap for ransom model on the high seas. In the Gulf of Guinea, we do see some kidnap for ransom, but also cargo theft of oil, theft from crews, hijack of ships, and resale of ships. In Southeast Asia, again, a slightly different pattern. A lot of historically hijack of ships, theft of cargoes, and so on, and more petty piracy in the sense of piracy, the theft of belongings, and so on. So very different forms of pirate business model, forms of organization in different parts of the world. So when we look at that, one of the things we can say about piracy is that piracy and pirates is that they tend to be highly adaptable. If we're looking at pirates as organized criminal networks don't tend to do just one thing. They change their activities in response to, for example, new opportunities or law enforcement pressures. And we see that within piracy all the time. So one of the great success stories of counter-piracy is the way in which piracy off the coast of Somalia was contained in the early 2000s, and we might in the early 2010s. So we might say more about why that was able to happen. It was in part a reflection of the pirate business model. But the Somali pirate networks, the kingpins who were running the show, did not go away, were not apprehended, or if they were apprehended, they managed to escape or get out of prison or whatever, and transferred their activities into other forms of maritime crime, such as smuggling of arms, of people, of charcoal between Somalia and Yemen, for example. And so smart pirates may shift into other forms of activity. In the Gulf of Guinea, law enforcement pressures around the Niger Delta region have pushed pirates into different geographical areas. So operating, for example, off the coast of Cameroon instead of off the coast of Nigeria. In Southeast Asia, we've seen a shift from, which is a region with relatively strong maritime law enforcement and regional cooperation, a shift from the hijack of ships for resale to the theft of more mundane sounding cargoes that are easier to dispose of, like scrap metal. So when we look at piracy, we see a highly diverse phenomena and an adaptable phenomena. And it's perhaps more useful to look at the nature of the criminal network, the political economy of the region, and the kind of business models that those networks are using, than to try and talk about piracy as a single phenomenon.
I have one question from students that I couldn't answer, I have to admit, when I was teaching. And that's, if we speak about piracy, for instance, Somalia, Yemen, is this a one organization, or there are many organizations that are related to piracy? That's the first question. And the second question, is there any global piracy organization, like, let's say, global mafia style of organizing those people? Or when we speak about piracy, usually it's local or regional, because I think that's quite important to explain, because sometimes you have those, as you said, lucrative cargo, and people might ask what's happening after. And if you have something very valuable and you are in Somalia, you need some people to either sell it or use it, and that requires more resources and more connections internationally. So
Yeah.
how is that phenomena, and what's behind?
So a classic academic answer is that it's both.
Okay.
So, but piracy tends to be regionally specific. It is in large part the business models of pirates are in large part determined by the local political economy. So, for example, the kidnap for ransom model, which involved the hijack of large vessels and then retaining those vessels sometimes for years, um, was dependent on a relatively isolated Somali coast with weak law enforcement, where the pirates could essentially, keep their ships and crews. Um, but in a region too without significantly developed coastal infrastructures, economic infrastructures. That's in contrast to the Gulf of Guinea, where piracy is largely determined by the local oil economy. Now, if piracy in the Gulf of Guinea is primarily about the theft of oil cargoes, that means you need to then sell those cargoes. You need to have mechanisms to dispose of large amounts of stolen oil on land, and that requires a certain degree of infrastructure in the oil industry, as well as the capacity to to bribe and to pressure local officials or elites in order to allow that to happen or to enable you to do that. So in that sense, the models of piracy are quite regional. Within those regions, you have different pirate organizations, so it's not one single hegemonic. It's not one kingpin for. There wasn't one kingpin for all of Somali piracy. There were a number of kingpins, and likewise elsewhere. But because these are sophisticated, modern, organized criminal networks, they are necessarily global too. The profits of piracy, and in Somalia it was many, many millions, are laundered through the global financial system. Criminal finance for piracy is not necessarily based within the region. We might see finance coming from outside, for example. So we have to understand piracy in one sense as a regional phenomenon, but also a regional phenomenon that is rooted and nested within a wider global political economy and financial system, which pirate networks can exploit and use in the same way as other criminal networks, like, for example, drug traffickers in South America. So it is both regional and local
Right.
and global, sorry, and local as well, actually.
Yeah, I think yeah. I mean, it's very interesting because sometimes we are thinking about pirates as being one ship attacking someone or
Hmm.
something, but as you said, it's a sophisticated network. What would be, or what are the main structural conditions that enable piracy to persist?
Yeah, there's actually quite a lot of research on the root causes of piracy. So when we look at maritime security as a whole, piracy has received a lot of attention from academics and from policymakers. So there is more work, more data that we have on piracy, particularly Somali piracy, than almost any other area of maritime crime or blue crime. So we have a good sense of what the root causes of piracy probably are. Most of those lie on land. Piracy is expressed at sea, but it is organized on land. Profits are laundered on land. The criminal networks are based on land. And it often involves quite deep-seated structural issues that are difficult to address through, for example, a law enforcement response. So often, when we're talking about root causes, we're really looking at kind of development responses more than law enforcement responses, which of course makes them very difficult to deal with. So, in terms of what those conditions are, well, in our recent book, Understanding Maritime Security, which is here, available at all good bookshops, we identify 7 root causes of maritime crime generally, but particularly a lot of these root causes are drawn from research on piracy specifically. Now, one of those is something you can't do anything about, and that's simply geography. Piracy tends to take place in regions where there are lots of ships passing through. It provide that provides lots of targets. It also provides potential concealment for maritime criminals, in this case piracy. So if you look at Somalia, it was on one of the major global trade flows. Same in Southeast Asia, in the Gulf of Guinea, it's the epicenter of the regional oil economy. So it is in part determined by geography. It's determined by the availability of suitable skills. In order to conduct piracy, you need people with boat handling skills, some degree of seamanship, perhaps, depending on the business model, a willingness to use violence. And that's something that is present in a lot of coastal communities. It's one of the reasons why pirates are able to adapt between different crimes as well. But those skills are necessary. Generally, in terms of root causes, piracy doesn't come from nowhere. It tends to take place under circumstances where regions, particularly coastal regions, face economic dislocation and exclusion, whether that's in terms of declines of coastal livelihoods or whatever. That creates economic conditions where people may be tempted to engage in piracy to help make ends meet. And potentially it provides a moral justification as well. So one of the features of Somali piracy was that, at least at the very beginning, it was narrated or understood by many Somalis in a defensive manner, in that because of the collapse of the Somali state, nobody was policing Somali waters. So in the 2000s, you had foreign industrial fishing vessels coming in, sucking up all the fish. There were vessels dumping toxic waste in Somali waters and so on. And piracy initially seems to have begun as a sort of informal Coast Guard response. Now, I think we need to be careful not to overplay that, because very, very quickly, as I've implied, Somali pirates became highly sophisticated, organized criminals with quite pathological effects on global trade and on the crews of those that they kidnapped. But that initial defensive justification, that defensive narrative, provided a kind of a moral justification for piracy in the region, and also a degree of legitimacy amongst local communities. And in Somalia, it still persists to this day. We see piracy often taking place in regions where there are wider patterns of insecurity and violence. So where, for example, it might not be unusual for fishermen to go out carrying a gun. How do you know that a vessel, a skiff, is not just a fisherman carrying an automatic weapon to defend themselves, or is it a pirate boat? Piracy tends to take place, although not always, in regions with weak law enforcement and corruption. So again, off the coast of Somalia, the collapse of the Somali state meant there was no local law enforcement. If we look in the Gulf of Guinea, again, corrupt practices within the local port and coastal communities enable pirates to move on their cargoes and so on. If we look at Southeast Asia, the picture is a little bit different, because, as I've implied, maritime law enforcement in Straits of Malacca and Singapore is quite strong, but that in turn pushes pirates into particular kinds of activities and business models. There's often a degree of cultural acceptability that comes back to the defensive narrative and social exclusion, that actually, these are activities that local communities do not see, at least as necessarily and always, as being wholly illegitimate under their circumstances. And importantly, and this comes back to the organizational point, piracy requires criminal entrepreneurs. It needs people who are able to plan, prepare, invest into pirate activities and to make them successful. And then beyond those reasons, the shape and the nature of piracy tends to be determined by the local political economy in the way that I've already implied.
Tim, do we have any numbers? How big are those organizations? For instance, you want to kidnap someone. How many people are there involved in this activity? Or those attacks on the tankers, for instance, that we read about, Are there people like 20 people in a very highly specialized group, or is it we're talking about like 100 people involved in piracy?
So again, when we're looking at a network, we're generally talking about quite a lot of people with different roles within that network. So you'll have the actual attack crews who go out and do the piracy themselves. But if you're kidnapping crew, you then need somewhere to put those crew, someone to look after them, or at least make sure that they're getting some food and or making sure that they can't escape. They need guards. So what you see, particularly the kidnap for ransom, well, with the kidnap for ransom model, you see actually that the supporting infrastructural, almost human resource requirements of piracy stretch a lot further than simply the people who go out in the skiffs and attack the ships. There's a whole, if you're going to hold on to a crew for a year and a half, you need a whole infrastructure to enable you to do that. So generally, there's the kind of the attack crews, there's the kind of the wider logistical and supportive structures, and then there's the organizational structures, both in terms of the criminal organization itself and the wider criminal networks that it feeds into in relation to finance and money laundering, cargo, you know, profit laundering and so on. Again, you look at the Gulf of Guinea, you maybe see a similar pattern, but again, determined by the business model, determined by the local political economy. So you might, for example, have, again, you will have organizational structures, you will have the people who go out and attack the vessels, but then within that you will have a series of contacts and networks on land who enable, for example, a tanker full of oil to be offloaded at a quiet port somewhere, and then that cargo sold on. So generally, again, these are not just four guys in a skiff. These are organized criminal structures as within much larger networks. And then, of course, those networks themselves coexist alongside, or sometimes in collaboration with, other non-state actors within those regions. So within Somalia, for example, there is some suggestion that what has become the pirate networks are now primarily smuggling networks, engage in smuggling activities for example, Al-Shabaab. And part of the way in which Al-Shabaab is funded is through the smuggling of, say, charcoal, illicit charcoal, that is carried out by those networks. So we see, again, it's this kind of idea of a networked crime, an organized and highly networked crime, that I think is important to grasp when we think of piracy. This is not this is not simply a phenomena of four guys with some Kalashnikovs going out in a skiff. It is, although that obviously is the face of it often. It is a much wider and more sophisticated phenomena than that implies.
The next question is about what we can do against piracy. And basically, when we think internationally, there are some forces, international naval operations, and things like that. Even we speak about NATO sometimes. And on the other hand, there are private companies. You can hire specialists, ex-military people, and they might also help. So how do you see those two sort of styles of fighting piracy and how they operate internationally, and what's the effectiveness based on your research?
So the effectiveness of both navies and armed private security, well, they can be very effective, but within certain limits. So the first thing to say is that if we're talking about the root causes of piracy, a naval response or the placing of armed guards on ships is not able to address any of those root causes. So you can deal with the expression of the phenomena at sea through law enforcement or armed security, but you are not necessarily going to target those criminal networks, the finance networks, those underlying social and economic conditions in coastal communities through a naval response. So it is necessarily limited. Having said that, and under certain circumstances, we know that a concerted international response can be very significant. So if we look at Somalia, We see a mobilization of a truly multinational um, mo naval coalition to combat to piracy off the coast of Somalia. We see the introduction of, for example, high risk zones at sea, which are patrolled by naval forces and so on, which undoubtedly made the pirates' task riskier and more difficult. And as part of an adaptation to that, over the course of the early 2000s, we saw pirate attacks getting further and further out into the Indian Ocean as the areas where they had traditionally predated became better policed. But the naval response was not enough on its own. So, in relation to Somali piracy, we also saw the creation of a special legal system to deal with pirates that were captured on the high seas, because there's always a question of what you do with them under the flag state regime. If you're a foreign naval vessel, for example, we saw a declining cultural acceptability in the coastal communities on whom they were dependent, because piracy was bringing in so much money. It was also bringing lots of problems, drug abuse, prostitution, all these things which were actually turning the coastal communities against the pirates. And then critically, the use of private armed guards on ships. Now, that's actually was quite a controversial development that took quite a lot of negotiation with the shipping industry, particularly. But it seems to have made perhaps the most significant difference in actually containing Somali piracy, alongside other self-defense activities that the shipping industry was able to take, the use of razor wire, traveling at certain speeds and to prevent boarding and so on and so on. And all that meant was that essentially piracy became a little bit too risky in off Somali waters and was contained. But as we noted, it did not address the criminal networks that moved into other areas. Now, the track record with naval responses and the use of armed guards in other areas is a little bit different. It suited the Somali model, the Somali piracy model, because of the way those attacks took place on the high seas, against against container ships, large vessels moving through international sea lanes. More difficult in the Gulf of Guinea, where we have seen armed guards, but where also there piracy, or the pirates have shown a greater willingness to use violence. So one of the things that we see in the Gulf of Guinea is the use of armed guards, yes, but those armed guards meeting violent responses from pirates more often, and being killed sometimes through them. So it's not, again, a uniform phenomena. Certainly, I think if we look at the Gulf of Guinea, actually law enforcement responses there have begun to make a difference to piracy in the region. But it is a different kind of problem to address, again, than certainly than the Somali one, and again, it's different to the problem in Southeast Asia. So the answer is essentially yes, within limits.
Hopefully, it will get better, and I think we also need support from neighbor countries. That's quite regional, because you have that jurisdiction and those laws about the sea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, Martin. So
Yeah,
this is the case with all maritime security, really. Maritime security is fundamentally both a regional and a transnational problem, because obviously, if we're looking at a ship, it crosses between state jurisdictions. It operates in places of special legal jurisdiction, such as the high seas. And so do the criminals. They move between and across borders. So one of the key responses to maritime security is around regional coordination and information sharing, in order to enable impacted countries to work together to address regional and transnational problems. I mean, the other thing that's important here is the sort of public-private dimension, particularly with relation to piracy, because of course the targets of piracy tend to be privately owned ships, privately owned vessels and shipping companies. That, I think, is important when we look at the armed guards issue, because armed guards are very expensive, and most shipping companies are operating on very, very tight. Most 70%, I think, of shipping companies across the world operate fewer than 15 vessels. So most shipping countries are not your enormous Maersk style global conglomerates. They're much smaller operations working on much tighter margins. That's particularly the case when we look at somewhere like the Gulf of Guinea, where there's a big small tanker trade. Most of those small tankers are owned by smaller companies, and those companies do not necessarily have the resources to employ armed guards. So again, how these responses play out, I think, is dependent on all these different kinds of factors.
Let's turn the page, Tim, and let's speak a little bit about geopolitical assertiveness, which is a very popular topic. And we speak a lot about assertiveness associated with China, but China speaks about assertiveness associated with the United States. How do we know, or is there any definition of assertiveness in maritime spaces regarding to security? And when is it assertiveness and when is it activities within international law?
So I think you could, well, so the first thing to say is that assertiveness in this regard is a little bit of a colloquial term. There's no specific definition of it. It's quite useful to summarize some of the things that are happening geopolitically at sea, but I think it's probably more helpful to actually to turn to the established literature on sea power, which is concerned with how states and navies particularly exercise power, influence, and compete in the maritime domain. And in that respect, rather than assertiveness, I would be interested in focusing on issues of maybe strategic intent and effect, and how compete states that are competing geopolitically are looking to achieve their strategic goals, and with what effect. And we can use a variety of different concepts from the sea power literature to help us with that. So sea power, for example, talks a lot about sea control, the securing of the seas for your own or your allies' purposes in relation to in today's context, largely in relation to global trade, free movement of global trade, for example, sea denial, the denial of the use of the seas to others, power projection, the use of the seas to project power, military power, diplomatic power to other parts of the world, whether through an aircraft carrier or a naval diplomatic mission. You can try and deter other states at sea, or you can compel those states to do something. And then the other one of the concepts I always find most interesting from the sea power literature is one of presence. And that's the idea that because navies and naval vessels are inherently mobile, they can move in and out of different types of waters from the high seas, they can cross the globe and so on. That enables states to use them for presence, that you show the flag somewhere. And that can be in order to, for example, imply a threat to another country, or to reassure an ally. So there are all these kinds of different strategies of how we might use naval power at sea to achieve particular strategic ends. So what we mean when we talk about assertiveness generally in the maritime domain are, at least how we talk about it today, are really, we're talking about coercive or norm-breaking acts that aim at either asserting or protecting maritime claims or particular positions within the maritime domain, or projecting power or presence to coerce or influence allies or adversaries. Now, what's different, because maritime states have always done this, it is almost the raison d'etre of navies to do these kinds of things. So what is different is the context of renewed geopolitical competition at sea and rising naval powers, rising, or in China's case, risen new maritime powers such as China. So at a time of competition between, for example, the United States and China at sea, including at sea, we're seeing what we might describe as more assertive activities within the maritime domain in order to pursue that geopolitical competition, either to kind of either to oppose it or to challenge it in various ways, or to, in the case of regional states like Vietnam and the Philippines in relation to China, to kind of defend their own interests in relation to these sorts of activities. And the outcome, of course, is a series of new tensions and flashpoints in areas like the South China Sea, for example. So I would think about it in terms of the traditional ways in which we think about sea power. I don't think there's anything particularly new going on beyond. Well, I think there are two new things. One is the context of the blue acceleration that I've already mentioned, and this kind of renewed geopolitical competition. But in terms of what is going on at sea, I don't think the things the sort of activities are necessarily particularly new.
The second problematic concept, I think, it's gray zone tactics. And you can read about it almost everywhere. And my question is, why do we speak about gray zone tactics? Why we don't have sort of it is legal or illegal activity instead? Is this because the law is not perfect, or is it because the new age, like we are living in 2025, is basically providing environment to be on the edge of the law? So we say gray zone tactics instead of legal or illegal. How is it, Tim?
So one of the whole points about what's sometimes called grey zone tactics is that it muddies the water between what is illegal and what is legal. Some grey zone tactics, some grey zone activities are sabotaging, cables and pipelines, or cyber attacks on ports are fundamentally illegal. But others may actually be about using the law in new or norm-breaking ways to try and again achieve particular strategic aims. So when we talk about the grey zone, and the grey zones, as you say, something that's very often talked about in relation to security at sea. What we're really talking about are coercive activities by states or their proxies that avoid the attributable or overt use of military force, and so fall below the threshold of war. So the idea is to try and achieve strategic aims perhaps through coercion, but in ways that are not going to expose you to a military response. And so grey zone activities are often sort of characterized as a sort of salami slicing tactic, that you do lots of little things where the threshold of response is relatively low, but collectively those little things add up to a big thing.
Why? Sorry, Tim. Why we can't have those small things, as you said, illegal by law? Is there no international consensus to make
some
it?
some of them are illegal.
Okay.
But the other point about grey zone activities, if that's what we call them, some people don't like the term grey zone precisely because they say that it actually obscures the strategic intent and purpose behind it, and so we might use a term like hybrid war instead if we wanted to. But the whole point of grey zone activity is also to obfuscate responsibility and make attribution difficult. So, for example, if we look at the sabotage, the likely sabotage of submarine cables and pipelines in the Baltic or around the seas of Taiwan, we need to say likely sabotage because often, I mean, in some cases we know it was sabotage, but often it's not entirely clear whether this was an accident, whether it was a deliberate act that looked like an accident. And then the question is, how do you prove that? And who was responsible for it? So the whole point about grey zone activities is that it makes attribution and a response based on that attribution very difficult to implement. And again, it comes back to the point about why what are these activities just not illegal? Well, a lot of them are not illegal. So they may be norm breaking. So for example, one of the tactics that China has used and is often referred to as a grey zone tactic is the use of its fishing fleet in very large numbers to essentially occupy territory in the waters of neighboring states. Now, that fishing fleet, as long as it's not fishing, is not doing anything wrong. But if you have 200 Chinese vessels sat in your exclusive economic zone, that prevents access from your own fishermen. There's always a chance they could fish and do something illegal. Um, and in the process of doing that is asserting a maritime claim by China. So, but it is not strictly an illegal thing to do. It's a norm challenging, it's a coercive, it's a hostile thing to do, but it's not an illegal thing to do. And again, we might look at grey zone activities that are about using the law in creative ways in order to achieve these goals, or reinterpreting the law in ways that again are norm breaking or not the usual way in which the law of the sea is interpreted. So actually one of the responses to the cable breakages in the Baltic and indeed the wider problem of the Russian shadow fleet, which is the sort of fleet that is breaking Russian sanctions by smuggling oil, by countries in the Baltic region, has actually been to rather creatively think about some of the provisions within UNCLOS and other parts of law of the sea around reasons for why those ships might be intercepted. Now, it's actually very difficult under UNCLOS ships have the right of innocent passage, or in straits and choke points, the right of transit passage. So you need a very, very good reason, and normally the permission of the flag state in order to interdict that ship. But there are potentially some legal loopholes around, for example, marine environmental protection. So we may say, look, this vessel is unseaworthy, and therefore we are going to do a safety inspection on it. Now, that's in some ways, the Russians would interpret that as lawfare. That's a kind of grey zone activity justifying the boarding of Russian vessels under circumstances where that would not normally be allowed or be seen as acceptable. So it's legal, but it's right. It's pushing the bounds of established interpretations and norms of how those laws are normally interpreted. So the point about the grey zone is that it is in a grey zone legally often. It is not entirely clear whether these are legal or illegal actions, and if they are illegal, it's not entirely clear, though you may be expected to suspect the perpetrator who was behind it, but you can't prove it, and you can't really attribute it in such a way that justifies a response. And you may not want to attribute it in a way that justifies a response if that then requires, for example, initiating some kind of forceful response to Russia, for example. So the grey zone it provides a space for competition between states that is very difficult to deal with, but also in a funny sort of way can allow some of the more sort of dangerous implications of direct military confrontation to either be dodged or maneuvered around.
Many say that international law, when we speak about coercive geopolitical behavior, basically doesn't matter, because the big powers, they do what they want, they interpret the law how they want. So the follow-up logical question, is there any consensus worldwide to innovate UNCLOS or related regulations so we have stricter rules on the seas?
So two things around that. I mean, I think the point about great powers being able to do what they want at a certain point is true. In extremis, that is true. In wars of national survival, in wartime, that's true often. And even then, that takes place within constraints. But actually, most geopolitical international interactions are not these kind of extreme circumstances. So yes, in extremis, but most international politics does not take place in extremis. And in that context, international law, I think, still plays a very important role, and a constraining role, often even on great powers. Although, as you note, in extremis, this is something that they can ignore. In relation to UNCLOS, I think we need to. So I think understanding what UNCLOS is very important. It's also important to understand that UNCLOS does not stand alone. often I think there is too much focus on UNCLOS. And the reason for that is that UNCLOS is an extraordinary, remarkable treaty, agreed by almost everyone, not everyone. I mean, the United States didn't ratify it, for example. But has really been very successful in establishing a legal regime for the oceans that most states buy into. But it doesn't do everything. It wasn't designed to do everything, and it sits alongside a whole range of other maritime governance structures, other parts of law of the sea, and so on. And if you're interested in that, we actually, along with my co-authors Christian Buger and Jan Stockbrugger, produced a paper for the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research on maritime governance at sea, where we map this network of regional maritime governance, including but also going beyond UNCLOS. So one of the great successes of UNCLOS is actually a geopolitical one. It has been very successful at peacefully managing maritime disputes at sea between states. And there's actually quite a lot of those, largely due to contestations over the interpretation of UNCLOS criteria for drawing maritime boundaries, for example, and other sorts of contentions as well. Now, many of those disputes have been settled under UNCLOS, but many of them have not, and they remain largely peacefully managed. I mean, that's a real success story that should be celebrated. And I think often in international politics, there's a temptation to focus more on the crises and the more difficult aspects of state relations. But there are some success stories too, and certainly I think the way in which the impact UNCLOS has had on managing interstate disputes at sea has been very, very successful. But we also know and need to recognise that UNCLOS has a series of important limitations as well. Particularly in relation to outright geopolitical conflicts and indeed to how it handles grey zone activities. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that UNCLOS is, and always was, and never aspired to be any more than, a peacetime treaty between states. It has very little to say and aspires to say very little about conditions of war. It's just not the intention of the treaty to do that. It also doesn't have very much to say about non-state actors, apart from pirates. It says a lot about piracy, but not really many other non-state actors. So in that sense, it's not particularly well equipped to deal with highly militarized disputes at sea. Now, we do have other international law that can help us there. Generally customary law. So the San Remo manual and the Newport manual are generally seen as a kind of customary law around warfare at sea, but they're not UNCLOS. They're not UNCLOS treaties. The other point to make about UNCLOS was that, of course, it was a treaty of its time. It reflects the concerns and priorities of the 1980s when it was negotiated, and an awful lot has changed since then. So since UNCLOS was negotiated, we've really seen the acceleration of globalization. We've seen this blue acceleration, this maritime industrialization that I mentioned earlier, which means there's vastly more things happening at sea than there were in the mid-1980s. We are more dependent on the sea, and those things create vulnerabilities, and was the case in the 1980s. And there's also been a whole series of technological developments that were just not envisaged in the 1980s. I mean, this was before the internet. We might think about drones, about GPS, for example, AI, and so on. Again, those things did not exist when UNCLOS was negotiated, and so UNCLOS has some sort of blind spots in those areas. And I think that in turn points to the need to place UNCLOS in context. We need to understand what it is, what it does well, but also understand what its limitations are and where those limitations come from. And if there are limitations, where else do we look in this kind of regional patchwork, this regional network of maritime security governance in order to manage those kinds of issues? I think the second part of the question, Martin, was around, does international law matter in the face of unilateral actions by great powers? I mean, I've already implied that yes and no. Under extremists, states can ignore it. see China ignored the judgment of, I think it was the ITLOS, I think it was an ITLOS, International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea judgment on the status of its claims in the South China Sea. For a very long time, the UK ignored international judgments on the Chagos Islands. So these things can be ignored, but often there are costs to doing so in terms of reputation, sometimes in terms of sanctions, and in extreme cases, becoming a sort of pariah state. So even though so I do think we need to look at how international law can constrain states in meaningful ways, even if in extremist that it may not do so. I mean, the other reason international law works is because most international law is because it is incorporated into domestic legislation. So when states ratify a treaty, they then incorporate that treaty into their own domestic legislation. So in some ways, international law is a little bit of a misnomer because it's actually the teeth of international law are often domestic in any case. And I think when we look specifically at UNCLOS, one of the things that's striking is that UNCLOS has largely worked, and it's worked in ways that generally suit everybody's interest. It underpins globalization and world trade. It successfully manages maritime disputes. And it's notable that while UNCLOS has sometimes been contested, sometimes even coercively contested, if we look at the South China Sea, not really in ways, I don't think, or at least I would argue, that fundamentally challenge the international treaty consensus around the treaty itself. Even the United States, which didn't ratify UNCLOS, recognizes it as customary law and largely abides by its provisions. Now, none of that's to say it's perfect, but I think it is essentially a success story, and under most circumstances, it works. We may want to look at how we govern some of it, or we address some of its oversights through other legislation, through other maritime governance arrangements, and so on. But my view at the moment, at least, is that UNCLOS is still solid and generally a beneficial thing to most states.
Tim, there are certain choke points, maritime choke points in the world that we know about them, and there is a question coming from many that if those choke points are very important for the global stability and security, are they considered to be international waters, or they are considered to be local territorial waters? And what's your research about the security and security threats to those choke points?
Okay, so let's talk about the threats first, and then legal status. And basically, the answer is that choke points, or international straits, as they're called in international law, have special provisions. So they are a zone of special legal jurisdiction that exist in alongside and sometimes parallel to other legal zones at sea. But you're absolutely right in your first point around just how critical a relatively small number of maritime choke points are to global trade and to the global economy. So we might think, for example, of the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which leads into the Red Sea, the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Gibraltar, the Strait of Hormuz, the Turkish Strait, or even the English Channel or the Danish Strait. So, I mean, I've already named most of the important choke points just there. And vast amounts of global trade pass through these narrow sections. 25% of all global traded goods pass through the Strait of Malacca. 30% of all oil through the Bab el-Mandeb. So straits are critical to global trade and to the global economy, but they're also critical to global data flows, because the choke points are not just about shipping, they're also about submarine cables and pipelines. So, for example, the Red Sea, I think, has 17 data cables passing through it, which between them carry around 20% of global data traffic. So they're choke points for trade, but they're choke points for other things too. Critically important. Choke points face a number of different risks by their very nature. Um, First of those is closure by accident. So you might think back to 2021 when the container vessel Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. That was a world loss event. It cost billions. One container ship blocking a choke point for, I think it was a week or something like that. Enormous impact from an accident with a single vessel. Choke points might be closed or put at risk by deliberate action, whether by states or by non-state actors. We only need to think of the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb today, or various kind of tanker war issues in around the Strait of Hormuz in the past. There is an environmental risk with choke points. So one of the ships that was sunk by the Houthis in 2024 was the Rubimar. The Rubimar was carrying 20,000 tons of fertilizer. It has still, I don't think, been recovered yet. So that fertilizer is sat at the bottom of the Red Sea. Red Sea is enormously biodiverse. It's why people go on diving holidays to Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. It's full of corals, enormous marine biodiversity. Now, but if that fertilizer leaks, as my colleague Christian Buger's fond of saying, it would turn the Red Sea into a green sea because of the fertilizer and algal bloom. So huge potential for environmental damage. And then there's potential for collateral damage because so many things happen in choke points. And a sort of a problem in one area can cause problems in others. So the Rubimar, when it was hit, actually drifted for some time and dragged its anchor while it was doing so. And in so doing, it cut through several undersea data cables with an estimated impact on 5% of global data traffic. So you can see how this concentration of activities in choke points creates particular vulnerabilities. Are they international waters? Well, almost by definition, choke points are not international waters because a choke point is where two areas of land, often between two different countries, are close together. So under UNCLOS and its territorial zones, the sea that is up to 12 nautical miles from the baseline, which is essentially the coast, is territorial waters. Out to another 200 miles from a baseline is the exclusive economic zone. So in most cases, choke points fall within states' territorial waters. However, UNCLOS creates a special legal regime for choke points, which gives ships the right of transit passage through them. So essentially, it is illegal to, without very good reason, to interfere with the passage of traffic through with transit passage of a ship through a choke point, or through an international strait. So the short answer is there is a special legal regime that protects the flow of shipping through straits, and that determines their legal status. So they're not quite international waters. They're normally territorial waters, but territorial waters that operate under a specific UNCLOS regime.
What's your opinion about artificial islands? Because I read few articles and I also researched this area, and sometimes you have a choke point or critical undersea cables going through particular area, and suddenly close to this area an artificial island appears, and this artificial island was managed by China. And many people ask, how is it possible that you can build artificial island, especially when critical infrastructure or choke points are that close?
So it's possible because it's not illegal to do it. Again, it a little bit comes back to UNCLOS. I mean, what were people envisaging? I don't think when UNCLOS was ratified, people were envisaging the creation of artificial islands for strategic purposes. I mean, when we look at the island building in the South China Sea, I mean, this is something that I think we fit fairly in. Well, we can either say it's hybrid warfare or grey zone. It clearly has strategic intent. I mean, often these are built around rocks or coral outcrops that are either sometimes contested between states or claimed or owned by one or other of the states, and then built up using sand and concrete and all these things. And of course, what that enables you to do is actually enables you to kind of claim that in a very concrete way if that area is contested. It also enables you potentially to project power and to threaten, as you say, shipping lanes that are close to it, and so on and so on. If some of these islands have got military airstrips built on them, and so on. So I think we need to see the building of artificial islands as part of this wider process of contestation, of geopolitical contestation, particularly in the South China Sea region, and about the strategic competition and assertion and enforcement of maritime claims, some of which are potentially illegal in that region. So that's how I would approach the island building thing.
We spoke about critical undersea infrastructure, Tim. Based on your research, what's your opinion about the role of private actors being used as criminals to do some bad things to that infrastructure? For example, someone wants to damage an internet cable or a gas pipeline. And those systems, they should be protected in some way. But still, we read and we research many incidents that happened. Why is it that?
So there's a couple of questions there. So on private actors, first of all, are states, if you like, using proxy actors to do this damage for them? So it is the nature of grey zone activity, but it's difficult to attribute responsibility for this kind of thing, and that's exactly why you might want to use a private actor. It's notable that a lot of the cable breaks in the Baltics have been carried out by civilian vessels. What's less clear was, were those civilian vessels actually directed or encouraged to do so, for example, by the Russian government? That's the nature of the kind of the tactic as a play. So, but the prima facie case seems to be that this is fairly common. I mean, it's a classic grey zone tactic that you use a proxy to do it instead of your own, military forces that are identifiable, where you can, be where responsibility can be allocated. But it's also something that we know is very common in other areas. So, for example, when we look at cyber attacks, we know that there are lots of cyber attacks by non-state groups, whether for criminal purposes or if we look at Russia or China, for example, nationalist groups who carry them out for sort of political nationalist purposes. We know in relation to Russia that the Russian government has relations with some of these groups. So we know it's there in other areas. I would be very surprised if it's not going on at sea as well. In terms of why don't we protect cables better? I mean, it's a legitimate question, but the more you kind of look into it, the more questions and difficulties that raises. So, for example, one of the things to bear in mind is just the sheer size and scale of the global undersea cable network. There are around 1.5 million kilometers of undersea cables across the world. Most of those are privately owned and operated. And with the best will in the world, it is beyond the capacity for any government to patrol and protect all of those different cables, particularly as most of the expertise, most of the capacity is within the industry anyway. So there's a question of scale and how and what level of protection can you offer at scale. There's a question of how do you cooperate with industry to make cables more secure? For example, do you want to put in regulations that industry, when laying cables, hardens those cables? They put them, armor them with concrete or bury them, but that costs a lot of money. And that then raises the question, well, who pays for that? Is the industry expected to pay for it, either by passing on costs to its customers or to its shareholders, or are governments going to pay for it? And in most cases, nobody really wants to pay for it. And one of the reasons they don't want to pay for it is that actually it may be unnecessary. So, or at least under a lot of some circumstances, it may be unnecessary. So, if we look, for example, at the cable network around the UK or in the wider North Atlantic, one of the things that's very striking is just how dense that network is. There are thousands of cables, coming into the UK as a key transatlantic node. Now, what that means is that you're unlikely to notice, if a cable or two or even three cables gets cut. So actually, there's a balance between, look, at what point, and cables get cut all the time due to accidents. So not all of the cable outages, in fact, the vast majority of cable outages are not to do with deliberate sabotage. So the question is then actually there is protection through kind of active protection like hardening, which is expensive, but there's also a protection through just resilience and redundancy, that you have so many cables that actually you can cut a bunch, it doesn't really make any difference and they can be repaired. So I think that then points to a question of criticality. And this is one of the issues that I think we need to wrestle with a little bit in this space at the moment is what we talk a lot about critical national maritime infrastructure protection, but not all infrastructure is as critical as others. So which bits are the really critical bits? They may be actually things like landing stations for cables. They may be connector nodes. They may be parts of the system where if that one part of a system gets taken out, there are cascading effects throughout the rest. And I think the point is that we don't currently have have our notion of criticality mapped onto our undersea infrastructures in as systematic a way as we might want. And that would allow you to then target more active protections responses at the really critical areas while taking a more kind of redundancy and resilience approach to the wider network.
The last question for today's interview, Tim. You wrote over 100 publications about maritime security and related topics. What is the most interesting and the most difficult topic when you research this area?
That's a really good question, actually, Martin. Partly because I really enjoy the maritime security work, so everything feels more like a kind of a challenge to meet than a difficulty. I mean, I think actually the most difficult thing comes back to a kind of common challenge of doing this kind of work that has a global scope, and that's actually incorporating and recognizing a global voice and a global perspective within the work, and actually particularly a perspective from local and more marginalized communities and parts of the world. So I think again it's very, let's take an example of some things we haven't talked about today around, for example, the implementation of marine protected areas. Marine protected areas are generally a really good thing. They protect biodiversity. They are a way of meeting the environment, or at least partially going some way to meet the kind of environmental crisis that the oceans face at the moment. But actually, the creation of a marine protected area has all kinds of other knock-on implications locally too. So if it's implemented in a crude way, without the input from the local community, for example, you may end up with a no-catch zone where people have historically fished and been dependent on fishing for their livelihoods, for generations. So suddenly you see a marine protected area becoming about an issue of blue justice, about how people are excluded from their fishing grounds, how the waters become enclosed. There's an impact of that on coastal livelihoods, potentially pushing people into maritime crimes as their fishing collapses. So I think the how we try to capture the voices and perspectives of the subaltern in maritime security is probably the biggest challenge, but also it's an absolutely critical one for us to address.
And the most interesting one?
Most interesting? Oh, it changes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It changes all the time. I'm very interested in the moment, precisely this intersection of environmental protection and security responses and some of the kind of unintended or pathological questions underpinning that. Very interested in blue justice in relation, again, to root causes issues, coastal communities, Who are the losers from globalization and what are the implications of that? I'm interested in all the issues that we've talked about today. Maritime security is an endlessly fascinating topic. Although the final thing I'm really interested in, it comes back to the point about success stories, Martin, is actually looking at nodes of cooperation as well as conflict. And in the maritime area, we have quite a lot of success stories in those areas too. So I think when we look at the international maritime order or maritime orders, clearly that is being challenged in some quite significant ways at the kind of level of high geopolitics. But nested within that are other kinds of ordering processes, but I think are less worrisome, actually quite positive. So I think how we govern the maritime domain, or how the maritime regime is governed, actually tells us a lot about how international politics sometimes works below the level of high geopolitics. And sometimes that's quite a positive story. So I want to end on a kind of up note.
For me, maritime security is very interesting because of the vocabulary. What is assertiveness? What is undersea cable? Why some choke points are choke points and others they are not, or things like that. I think there are so many details about cooperation, as you mentioned, and how the states try to create some special zones, special areas where peaceful maritime order can be implemented and people can enjoy the sea. And there are so many activities. Just Japan has the concept of Indo-Pacific, and South Korea as well. So I think there are so many details that we can research, and ocean is huge. There are many countries, many actors, many private actors. So it's a fascinating area. Tim, thanks again for being on IR Thinker.
My pleasure, Martin. Thank you.